George R.R. Martin planned for there to be a 5-year time jump in the middle of A Song of Ice and Fire. But what happened to that? And what does it being abandoned mean for the plot? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek. If you like theories, background, history and lore about A Song of Ice and Fire, The Lord of the Rings and The Witcher, this is the channel for you. Welcome. George R.R. Martin spent many years writing A Song of Ice and Fire with the intention of having a 5-year time gap partway into his story. It would have been between the end of A Storm of Swords and the beginning of A Dance with Dragons. Of course, he also later decided to divide the plot for A Dance with Dragons into A Feast for Crows too, but you get the point. After the end of A Storm of Swords, there would have been an in-world 5-year break before we catch back up with the characters and plot. Why? Well, when you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense to stretch the time out a bit. The characters in the book are all a bit younger than the casting on the TV show. In some cases, they are still very young children. For example, when the story starts, Arya is just 9 years old, Bran is 7, and Rickon just 3. Yes, the first 3 books cover perhaps 2 years, but that still leaves them very young when entering the final acts of the story, and we can expect Bran and Arya at least to play quite a significant role there. So the idea of aging them up 5 years or so makes a lot of sense. It also makes a lot of sense in terms of the threat from Dany's dragons. Giving them another 5 years to grow could make them scarily big. And when you look at the books, you can actually see the scaffolding that George R.R. Martin put into place to let all this happen. Most of the major characters are newly arrived at, or will soon arrive at, somewhere where they can train and grow in relative peace for 5 years. Arya in Braavos at the House of Black and White, Sansa in the Vale, Jon newly appointed Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Bran at Bloodraven's Cave, and so on. George clearly worked towards this idea through A Storm of Swords, expecting to have that 5-year gap. On the other side of the gap, he had planned for there to be an extra-long 250-page prologue chapter from the POV of Aeron Greyjoy, which would recap much of the high-level plot of what happened during those 5 years. Then we would have POV chapters from the other characters. They would think back to what had happened to them during that time, so the reader could catch back up. So that was the plan. The reasoning is clear, and he's clearly a good enough writer to make it compelling, so why didn't he go through with it? Well, because he eventually realised that Cersei, for example, wouldn't ever be able to just sit still for 5 years. This is what he had to say on it. I soon discovered the gap worked well with some characters, like Arya, who at the end of The Storm of Swords had taken off for Braavos. You can come back 5 years later and she has had 5 years of training and all that. Or Bran, who was taken in by the Children of the Forest and the Green Ceremony. So you could come back to him 5 years later. That's good, works for him. Other characters, it didn't work at all. I'm writing the Cersei chapters in King's Landing and saying, well, yeah, in 5 years, 6 different guys have served as hand, and there was this conspiracy 4 years ago, and this thing happened 3 years ago. And I'm presenting all of this in flashbacks, and that wasn't working. The other alternative was that nothing happened in those 5 years, which seemed anticlimactic. The Jon Snow stuff was even worse, because at the end of Storm he gets elected Lord Commander. I'm picking up there and writing, well, 5 years ago I was elected Lord Commander. Nothing much has happened since then, but now things are starting to happen again. I finally, after a year, said, I can't make this work. So the idea, despite its obvious appeal, didn't ultimately work. It took George a year of writing to finally come to that conclusion, however. Not that he probably viewed it as lost time. His gardener-writer approach means that he often goes down this kind of cul-de-sac, but he also doesn't throw away any of what he wrote. So we've actually read some of those chapters, reformatted for use elsewhere. To take just one example, the Arya chapter entitled Mercy, that we have as a pre-release chapter from the Winds of Winter, has, as he says, quite a history. Writing in 2014, he said that the first draft was written more than a decade ago. Originally, it was intended to be the opening Arya chapter after the infamous 5-year gap, her first appearance in A Dance with Dragons, as initially conceived. Then it was supposed to be a part of A Feast for Crows, after I abandoned the 5-year gap and split the books. Then it was going to be the concluding Arya chapter in A Dance with Dragons, but it seemed more like an opening chapter than a closing one. So shortly before A Dance with Dragons was published, my editor and I agreed to remove it from Dance and shift it over into Winds. Why is this important? Well, because it tells us that this chapter is indeed intended to be the beginning of the end of her time in Braavos. She would train for 5 years, then this. But it also means that we will probably get more chapters, or parts of chapters, in The Winds of Winter that were originally intended to be after that 5-year gap, but have now been postponed. Sansa about to leave the Vale, perhaps, or Sam in Old Town. Of course, the knock-on effects of this are more than just a handful of chapters. The characters who should have had 5 years training haven't. I mean, they will have had some time there. Arya has probably been in Braavos for 6 months or so, training with the Faceless Men. Similarly, Sansa in the Eyrie. I think George R. R. Martin has kind of stretched the story a bit here, introducing new POV characters and massive plot lines in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, like young Griff, the Dornish plotline, Brienne, Euron of Victarion, and so on. This has allowed our core and mostly still young characters to get a bit of training and growth, if not everything he had originally planned. And to be fair, this does mean we've got more great chapters to read. Instead of skipping straight from Arya on a boat to Braavos to the Mercy chapter, we got those fantastic chapters of her at the House of Black and White, so I'm actually taking this as a win. The downside, of course, is that those younger characters don't get aged up. What does that mean for the plot? Well, we have to be honest and say that we don't know, but presumably any more adult storylines that were intended for them either won't happen or will happen to other characters or in other ways. I think we can see a hint of this in the case of Ned Dane and Sir Gerald Dane, Darkstar. It's pretty clear from what George R. R. Martin has said that the character of Ned Dane, the 13-ish-year-old Lord of Starfall and nephew of Arthur and Ashara Dane, was destined for a significant, if not necessarily major, role in the later books. After 5 years, as an 18-year-old from a legendary family, we might expect him to. But without that 5 years, George R. R. Martin decided to give that role to someone else. A new character he created, also a Dane, Sir Gerald Dane. As an aside, I think that strongly hints that House Dane are still important enough to the plot to require an effective rewrite to make it work after the 5-year gap was abandoned. But more broadly, I think it shows how George will be handling any issues he has as a result of his characters not being as old as he planned. Some of their plot lines will be given to others if necessary, but most importantly, the overall direction of the plot will not be affected by this. If you'll forgive me a little cynicism, I think George, or perhaps we, sometimes overstate the importance of him being a Gardner writer. He's not just making everything up as he goes along. He may not have a detailed plan he is working to, but he knows, and has known for decades, the main direction of travel and the fates of the main characters. As for the dragons, well, no, they won't be as old as he had originally intended, but I think he can still come up with reasons for why they might have grown faster than expected. Rhaegal and Viserion are happily eating lots of the meat left over from the Second Siege of Meereen, and Drogon is living his best life, free to hunt and eat what he wants. What more does a dragon need to grow? And we even have a mysterious magic object handily introduced after the abandonment of the 5-year gap, Dragonbinder, that will seemingly help someone, perhaps ultimately Dany, to control her dragons. So although this does sound like a big issue, suddenly losing 5 years out of the timescale, I suspect that it actually won't turn out like that. Why? Because although characters may not have had 5 years to train up, they will still have had some time because of the stretching of the plot. Arya will still learn some assassin skills, for example, and Bran will still become a tree wizard. Which isn't to say, of course, that there won't be any changes, particularly for the youngest characters. With that in mind, I suspect it is now even less likely that Rickon, still only 5 or maybe 6 years old, will personally play a significant role in the story going forwards. He may well still be used by others as a figurehead, or a Stark they can put into Winterfell, but Rickon himself won't be the protagonist so much. The plots the younger Starks would have had will still go to them, and they deal with them at a younger age, or be passed to someone else, or just abandoned. Either way, we probably won't spot the joins, because this actually means we get more of the story, and have already had more of the story than George R. R. Martin had originally intended. Abandoning the 5-year time gap may have been frustrating for George, but it means that we get more story, and I'm grateful for that. If you'd like to see more A Song of Ice and Fire videos like this, there's a link to my playlist on the left of your screen now. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.